talking about a new hot topic in digital health called prescription digital therapeutics, and we've got quite a fantastic panel lined up for you. So I'm going to introduce you to our panel moderator, Scott Thielman, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Product Creation Studio. And Scott, I'll let you take it from here and introduce the rest of our guests. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you. Thank you, Lori. Glad to be here. My name is Scott Thielman. I'm Chief Technology Officer at Product Creation Studio. We're a design development firm up in Seattle, and we are super excited about prescription digital therapeutics, largely because some of them are going to include hardware, and that's kind of the thing we love. But most of these are systems that are based mostly currently on a digital experience, which really is kind of blows your mind when you think about the level of therapy that can be brought to real disease just through our phones, which or other digital delivery experiences. So very cool, very excited. I was going to look up a bunch of statistics on how much investment and new companies were entering this space, and I realized we almost don't need to. We've got, Therapeutics is represented, and they've just announced this week that they're I guess a SPAC IPO, essentially getting listed on NASDAQ. I believe some of the other ones are already on. There's a lot of excitement and investment going into this space. And really the space we're talking about, if you're like me, we've been talking about digital health, digital therapeutics for a while. But in this case, we're talking about the folks, not like, hey, let's just watch our heart rate and see if we can tune our sleep to feel a little bit better, to perform better on the field, to perform better at work. These folks are taking the hard road and saying, hey, we are going to be FDA approved. Not only that, we're going to require the supervision of a physician. So they're making their lives as hard as possible, but really having tremendous impact on their patient population. So it's very exciting. So I want to dig in and talk to them. I do give a brief introduction to the folks we have here. And we've got immediately to my left here is Gabe Strauss, Director of Product at Limbix, a company that's treating adolescent mental health issues. And then next to him, we've got Mike Rosenbluth, CEO and founder of Swing Therapeutics. And they're tackling, at least for the time being, fibromyalgia, autoimmune disease, and I believe pain management. We'll learn a little more from him. And then we've got Gordon Cass, Vice President of Engineering at Pear Therapeutics. And Pear is one of the older digital health groups, and they treat a number of diseases, but I think a lot of them, he'll tell us more about substance abuse, like opioid abuse, or some of the notable, and insomnia. And then on the far end there, we've got Kristen Weinholz, Chief Product Officer of Better Therapeutics, and they're going after cardiometabolic disease states. So very, very nice panel. We can cover a lot of territory in terms of the types of treatments. And I think let's just jump right in here. I want to first make sure you kind of give, in this first answer, I'll let you guys expand a little bit more about what your companies do and what really has drawn you to want to operate in this area. So, Kristen, I know your company is definitely tackling some big chronic health targets. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you believe your platform can have an impact where other big device and pharma companies have been going after these targets for quite a while with mixed results.
Yeah. It's a big question, and we are in an area with a really big problem. So I think the latest stats that I have seen are 35 million adults in the United States have type 2 diabetes, 70 million adults have hypertension, and another 40 million have hyperlipidemia, high cholesterol. So this is a big space. I think it's costing upwards of $450 billion a year to treat symptoms of these diseases. So I'm going to address a little bit the audacity that you alluded to, and why do we think we can do this when there hasn't been success with other more traditional treatments. So I think if you go on a little journey with me, I think there's kind of these three components. But the first is that we've really recognized that all of these cardiometabolic diseases share the same root causes. And those root causes are behaviors around poor diet, sedentary lifestyle, poor sleep, and stress. And so we know that if we can address these behaviors, we can actually start to solve the problem and not just continue to treat the symptoms. So that's the first piece. We also know that there is a pretty effective treatment for these types of behaviors, and that's cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a treatment that's usually delivered like in a clinical setting. It's a one-on-one therapy. It's quite expensive. And so for that reason, we realize it's not scalable. So this isn't a treatment that can address the totality of the problem with the magnitude of humans that are have been diagnosed. And I think the third thing that we recognize is we're at a unique moment in history where there is ubiquity and a level of intimacy with something that you carry around with you every day, and that's your smartphone. So we think the conjunction of all of these things gives us a pretty remarkable opportunity. So at Better, we have created a novel form of cognitive behavioral therapy. It is based on first principles of traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, but it is specifically to address nutrition, exercise, and address the behaviors that are causing these diseases. So we think we have a shot at this because we're at this unique moment in time, and we think that there is, we think that there is a possibility that technology can address this problem in a way that traditional pharmacotherapy can't.
Well, not to jump too far ahead, I think part of your role is to demonstrate, or part of your company's role is to demonstrate, right, the evidence that you actually are.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yes, we are currently in a clinical trial for type 2 diabetes, and we've started the first of a number of real-world evidence studies in type 2 diabetes after some successful pilot data.
Nice. Okay. Gordon, let's go to you as a computer scientist, and I'm an engineer myself, so I commiserate with you and what your role must be like. But really, your career has been dominated by technology companies. And when I looked at your resume, I saw sports companies, weather related companies, health, and not a whole lot of healthcare until you get to Therapeutics. So what can you tell us a story? What drew you to Therapeutics and this PDT challenge?
Okay, two topics there. So one is what drew me to Pear, and the other is I'll talk a little bit about Pear. What drew me to Pear is the mission of the company, and a lot of engineers feel the same way, and pretty much everybody we hire, mission's the number one thing on their minds. When you work in your field, which is technology, and you like the tech stack you're working in, what do you feel at the end of the day? And you can work for Lyft or Uber and help people get rides around town, nothing wrong with that. You could work for Yelp, get restaurant reviews up, that's cool. People get to eat at good restaurants. We like the idea that at the end of the day, we help people dealing with substance abuse problems, opioid addiction, insomnia, and other medical conditions with the software that we have produced. So the mission is the number one thing. I was at a company previous to Pear called Lumos Labs or Lumosity that did something in the space that kind of whetted the appetite maybe, but I've been at Pear 3.5 years and it's that mission. At the end of the day, what did you do? You help people dealing with these kind of issues. And we've had Zoom calls, and pre-COVID, people come into the office and they talk about how they use our smartphone apps and what their life has been through, what they've been through in their life and how it helps them. It's pretty striking. It's pretty meaningful. So that's what drew me to this space. The company itself, so we make PDTs, prescription digital therapeutics. We've had the first 3 ever cleared by the FDA, and thus they're prescribable by doctors. and people get them they get an access code, they download it on their smartphone, and it keeps them on track. We run studies to prove it helps them in their rehab. It avoids relapses and other things like that. And so we've got 3 that have been cleared, the first 3 ever. So we're a trailblazer. I think the number's up to 6 now, although the other companies are doing stuff in different treatment modalities. So it kind of is just validating the space and what the future of PDTs is.
Very nice. Yeah. And
Thank you.
I love to hear about that mission-based. I'm sure, I imagine everybody shares a little bit of that, and would love to hear more about it. Let's go to you, Mike. I think I hit Kristen with the boy, you're taking the hard road a little bit, and maybe you're really taking the hard road. You're trying to treat fibromyalgia, autoimmune disorder, and chronic pain, I believe. So these seem like a list that if I was your business strategist, I would be saying, well, let's avoid those for now and go do something easier. And you're just jumping right in and going after it. So what is it that drew you to, and you're as CEO and founder, right? So what drew you to start this emerging empire up and go after these really hard diseases?
Thanks for the question. So I think one thing to think about is just like the unmet need and the gap between what these patients need and what they're getting right now. And a lot of chronic pain conditions and especially fibromyalgia, which is for those who aren't familiar, it's a centralized pain condition where basically your brain is perceiving pain, you're feeling pain, but there's no peripheral injury for it. And it's terribly frustrating. You go to a doctor and the doctor says, there's nothing physically wrong with you, and there's nothing worse than going to a doctor and having that told to you when you're experiencing all these symptoms that are just really debilitating in your life. Unfortunately, the drugs for fibromyalgia and a lot of other chronic pain conditions are really narrowly focused on trying to reduce pain intensity. And they do it, they're helpful, but certainly not enough. But if you think about the experience of these patients, it's so much more than just the pain intensity. It's like how that pain is, interfering in their life. How they've had to change their life and the impact of the disease. There's like difficulties with sleeping. There's like reduced physical functioning. There's a difficulty in concentrating. And so even if you're able to help with the pain intensity a bit, there's just so much left that's on the table. I think similar to what Kristen said, that there's a whole lot of evidence around non-pharmacologic approaches having tremendous impact, like frequently more than the drugs, right? But there's just a real lack of access. And so when you pair the need, just like that big gap in need, along with just like the real wealth of evidence that this can have tremendous impact, some of these diseases that you think are the most terrible and challenging to go after are actually the ones that you can really make the most difference.
And as you're talking, it occurred to me, do you think, I don't know if you have a background in pharmaceuticals at all, but do you think Big Pharma kind of misses the mark on going after some of these? Do they even go after fibromyalgia? That's one that's, I think, is really a challenge, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 FDA-approved drugs for fibromyalgia, and they've been large drugs like Lyrica and Cymbalta that were really like some of the best-selling drugs for these pharmaceutical companies. And so, I think drug companies realize like the opportunity and the need. They're just really hard to drug with a chemical.
Right. Okay, great. Well, we may delve into that more later. I want to go over to Gabe, and of course, I want to hear a little bit more about limbics. You've got a really interesting patient population, adolescents, and in one sense, what a great group to go after because they all are getting immersed in their phones already. So why not use that to add a healthcare experience? But it's probably also a bit of a challenge, and so I imagine that patient population is really something that you've had to think about and has impacted your product strategy. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you strategize around reaching your patients.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, we're building prescription digital therapeutics for adolescent mental health. there's a huge access issue today. We hear that, for pediatricians, which are often the first line diagnosis of mental health conditions, they're screening for depression and anxiety at least annually, and there's around a 20% prevalence rate. And the first line treatment is generally therapy, but we know that most people can't get access to therapy. So what do? There's just wait lists, or maybe they'll prescribe medication, but very low effect sizes for antidepressants for adolescents. And even then, we know it's more effective when paired with therapy. And I'm sure it's similar for fibromyalgia and other medications and diagnoses as well. So our vision is a world where all adolescents have access to affordable, effective mental health care. And we think that digital therapeutics are a really, really important way to get there. Not the only way. It's not going to be the only vector, obviously, but a really important way to address that access gap. We're focusing on adolescents, which is really great because we can focus on a very narrow demographic and really deeply understand our user base. At Limbix, we really recognize that we are not the same as our users. We're adults, and for the most part, we don't currently have or even have lived experience with depression. So what's going to be motivating and engaging for us is not necessarily going to be motivating and engaging for our patient population. Also, another really interesting distinction here is between sort of medicine and taking your medicine. So in digital therapeutics, you can think of there are clinically active ingredients in the digital therapeutic, and then there is engaging with those clinically active ingredients. And that's really, really key. And to a large degree, one of the most challenging problems to solve for. And the key there is, for us, user experience testing and co-design. So really testing, formative testing, developing these features with our population. And there are 2 points I'd like to make there. The first is really important to have a dedicated UX researcher embedded in your product team. Far too often, you have a single product designer or a product manager even whose responsibility is to also do UX research. And it's one of those really high impact but often low urgency tasks that just falls to the wayside. So it's really important to have a dedicated person to just really, week in and week out, be speaking to your users and testing ideas. The second really great tool that we found, or technique, is to have a patient panel, or in our case, we call it the Teen Advisory Council. For us, it's 10 adolescents with lived experience of depression, and we, week in and week out, regularly test with that patient panel new ideas. We sort of divide it up into 5 and 5. 5 might ideate on a new feature, another 5 might give feedback. So if you want to learn more about that, we've actually written an article on our blog about co-design, which we call the secret sauce of digital health engagement. So recommend looking at that.
And you mentioned formative. Do you do summative too at the end?
Summative is part of the sort of the 510K submission or the pre-market submission. But at the end of the day, once you're at the very end, summative is just making sure everything does what you intended it to do. But I believe it's very valuable to do that formative testing before you get to that point.
Most of the testing ends up being formative anyway when you find something that needs to be changed.
Right.
And great point about the UX researcher. I echo that as well. I'm an engineer, and there's always some reason not to look at what the actual customer or user wants until you're faced with it. We always want to keep designing and designing until it's perfect. But we did the same at our company, hired a UX researcher and have that capability. And when you have that service that kind of holds the mirror up to, hey, here's what the patient population actually thinks. It's really powerful. Kristen, let's go back to you. Maybe tell us about who is your customer, since I just spoke about customers briefly. Who is the customer you need to convince the most? How do you accomplish that? I mean, I can imagine there's physicians we've established that physicians involved. There's a patient at the end. There's probably somebody who's paying for all of this.
Yeah.
Employers. So who
Well,
do
I
you
feel
have to
like
convince?
Gabe queued me up really well for this question. So I think at Better we face, the same trinity of customers that everyone here on the panel faces that you just mentioned. So it's the patient, the payer, and the provider, and we are courting them all and trying to convince them all that this is an effective treatment. But I'm a product person, so of course, for me, the key customer is the patient. And I recognize, and my product team recognizes, that at the end of the day, they're the center of this whole puzzle. In our pilot study, we recognize that the average user spent 5 minutes a day in our app over the course of 12 weeks. And that was a sufficient dose of our product to change their behaviors and to significantly lower their fasting blood glucose. So I see that the way I convince my customer is to create a really engaging product. I need something that can compete with Instagram. We're not competing with metformin. We're not, that's not what our job is, but we have to keep people coming back and interacting in the therapeutic behavior therapy that we've created, even though it's hard. And so that's the tough competition, and that's the customer that from a product lens we focus on. Luckily, other smart people within my company are unlocking the other parts of that equation. Exactly.
Okay, I got it. Yeah. Tongue in cheek, I want to ask you if you could. It sounds like you could underdose if the experience isn't great, but can you overdose ever? Or is it
right? I mean, you'd like to believe that, and we had some interesting personas emerge in our pilot study. We definitely had bingers, and statistically, they didn't do as well as people who did a measured dose day over day.
Right.
So it is interesting. I hadn't really ever thought about overdosing, but
So just an idea for the rest of you guys, you can make a therapeutic to prevent overdosing of Kristen's therapeutic.
Luckily, the worst thing that can happen to you if you overdose with our product is that your fasting blood glucose drops a little
Right.
bit,
Well,
and you
that's
have to
not
go
so
off
bad.
medication.
I need that after the sugar rush that I had just before that, so I apologize. Let's go, Gordon. Let's talk about patient data for a minute. And one aspect, of course, everybody always wants to talk about privacy and security, but let's talk about data integration, and because whether your real customer is the patient or the provider or the physician that you're dealing with, ultimately you want large adoption by some of these big payer groups or big healthcare organizations, and implementation could be either if you do it right, I imagine a benefit, or it could be a real hurdle to adoption. So maybe tell us a bit about the pair data model. Who owns the data that you gather, and is it a data play where they're trying to aggregate that and do something with it, or is it shared with the patient? Who owns it?
Data and data security are paramount to everything we do. The data we collect, if you want to say, well, who owns it? We own it in our data warehouse. We make information available to clinicians. We hold real tightly to security standards. We encrypt data in transit. We encrypt data at rest. And there's authentication needed for clinicians that are going to access some information about their patients. And we have some software in place that allows them to see only what they're supposed to see. And you put all that together and you monitor it real closely, and that's the approach we take. The other part of your question, we have people internal at Pair that look at the data for trying to communicate to payers, partners, or others about what's going on with our products. So that's done real closely. People have to be trained before they can even look at anything. And we track real closely who's looking at what, and it's logged and so on. But we will be collecting data, engagement of patients, how long they stay on the program, or if they drop out or stuff like that. So there is a usage of it. It will probably be looking at how to do more of that. It's mostly in communicating with partners, with insurance companies and so on, about all the patients that are on our products already, since we have 3 already out there, Reset, Reseto, and Somryst. We have a lot of data. Previously, we did studies on this before we move forward. But right now we have actual real life data, real world data of people using them.
Yeah, and you brought up, or I thought of a point as you were talking. We've been talking a little bit about I've been thinking about the patient experience, which is really important. But you mentioned the physician. If the physician's going to guide this, or their group is going to guide this, they need to have their own interface, right? And it's different than a patient's, right?
Yeah, it is different, and it's very important. So it's something that we have set up specifically to work for them, and it's something we're currently looking to enhance to make it more effective for them trying to keep a handle on their patients and how things are progressing.
Right.
But data is one of the most interesting things that's happening in this space, and the ability to collect data day over day with a device is really offering physicians the opportunity to make different and more informed decisions. I think it's really remarkable, and I think one of the most important things we'll see, one of the most important things we'll pay attention to in this space.
And I was going to see if we could do the whole talk without saying AI, but I just can't stop it when you say data. I have to say AI, machine learning. But is that part of it? The algorithms to, I always think of.
Ultimately, yes. I wish I could say that we were that sophisticated already, but we do have a treatment algorithm. I don't want to take airtime from the conversation, but we do have a treatment algorithm, but currently it's fairly rudimentary. I mean, sophisticated in the clinical sense, but when we see where it could go with aggregated data over a long period of time, and how we could change treatment in a very nuanced way in what we recommend to our patients for next steps, and understand what will actually be the most effective, I think that's when our product really starts to improve. And then I think exactly what Gordon was mentioning, when you can pass that data along to a physician, this is data that they don't typically have. They see patients maybe, if they're lucky, every 3 months, maybe, and typically in a much longer cycle. And so for them to be able to see data in timeframes like day over day or week over week, it allows them to make much more informed decisions.
Right. So, Mike, I want to come at it a slightly different angle, because I'm still interested in this: who's the real customer here, and who are all the users? And so, from your perspective, will your team win by convincing the patients to use it, or do you win by convincing the physicians to prescribe it? And I guess that's the part I'm really curious about is, do you really have to, it seems like if the physicians don't feel like they have time for this, or don't feel like they're willing to try it, that you've got a real hurdle because they have the key, right? They have to prescribe for your device to go forward, or your system to go forward.
Yeah, I think it's probably a yes and to everything. I mean, I think you certainly need patient motivation, right? Because what you're asking them to do is hard work, right? It's actually like looking within themselves, behavior change, like making things happen, and that's not easy. And so you need a motivated patient and a motivated patient population to make it work. Tying that with an engaging experience that actually encourages them to do it. I think. Sometimes one of the hardest probably behavior changes is physician behavior change, and changing the way that they treat their patients. And so I think that's certainly a thing too. And especially when you're giving them a new tool, a new technology, a new product, but one that sort of the core components of it, they may not be entirely familiar with, right? Like what the mechanism of action is. I think helping them gain confidence, helping them gain the confidence to prescribe it, and knowing that they have a partner there to support them along the way is super important.
Do you think COVID has helped flex their minds a little bit about technology having a role?
I think certainly. Certainly, I think when you see certainly telemedicine and the greater adoption of that has COVID has really broken down a lot of those barriers to the system that was preventing so many things. And I think digital experiences and remote software is doing the same. And so I think everyone's just gotten a lot more comfortable with technology. our clinical trials, when we were initially designing our clinical trials, people were like, "Oh, you can never do a remote trial, right? That would never. No, that's just not how clinical studies are done." And you're like, "Why?" And so, now I think that the way that we run trials certainly is drastically different, and I think that's just one of the exciting things about software too, is how you develop evidence and doing it in a drastically different way than everyone's used to.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see, Gabe. Let's go back to you. And I spent a little time on your blog, and you've offered some cautionary tales there of early digital health companies. I guess early is, in this case, maybe 2008, 2010 or something. So not so long ago for some of us, but some early tales of digital health companies pursuing a direct-to-consumer market, and then maybe that not going so well. So what I'm curious about is maybe tell us who the real customer is, and can you dig deeper into that value proposition for that customer?
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned engagement as being one of the major challenges. The other one is clearly commercialization. That's the hot topic right now. And it's become increasingly clear that FDA clearance, while maybe necessary, but it's very much insufficient to get reimbursement. So really, we're thinking about it in four ways. There's really four different dimensions that you have to kind of bring together to bring a package to the payers. The first is obviously clinical efficacy and evidence, which is relatively straightforward. There's the clinical trials show that you can treat that endpoint, that can treat your intended diagnosis. The second one is health economic outcomes. So are you able to sort of have a hard ROI impact on the bottom line for these payers? And that could be by treating conditions in a more cost-effective way than the existing treatments. Or it could be secondary effects, for example, treating mental health conditions for when they're comorbid with a chronic health illness, and it's lowering the bottom line there. But either way, you need to have that hard ROI. The third is provider adoption and demand. Once the therapeutic gets integrated with sort of the standard of care and those default workflows, there's just more and more, I guess, somewhat pressure or incentive for payers to reimburse it, particularly if there's clinical society support. You have those key opinion leaders saying, we really want to be able to prescribe. This is really necessary for our patient population. And then the fourth is patient adoption. So you really want to track, do patients want to use this? Are they using it? Are they reporting favorably on it? Because ultimately these payers want to attract members. And if the members and their employers really want to offer this, then the payers are going to pay attention. Because if not, then they risk the employer's going to another payer that will offer it. So I've written a little bit about flywheels. That was the latest topic I dove into, and there is somewhat of a flywheel sort of dynamic system here. The clinical trials are somewhat within your control, but the rest of them are all very interrelated, right? So how do you show provider adoption if the payers are not paying for it, and providers aren't going to pay for it, like you discussed? If the providers aren't going to prescribe it, if providers aren't paying for it, and similarly, if providers aren't prescribing it, patients aren't going to use it, to show that real-world economic outcome data. So where do you start? For us at Limbix, we're starting with the provider. We actually have a unique opportunity under the FDA's guidance, public health emergency guidance, actually go to market with our product code early under discretionary enforcement. So any licensed healthcare provider can actually offer SPAC RX to adolescents today. And so we're starting to generate, that provider traction, patient traction that way. And then once we do get cleared, we'll have a really, really strong kind of package of those four dimensions to bring to the payers to make a really compelling case for reimbursement.
So, and I have a little bit of a game plan of questions. I want to insert something here because I feel like we might miss it if we don't otherwise. And also, I want to say, folks, start thinking about questions. We'll try to leave a few minutes at the end where you can throw a few questions at this esteemed panel. But I'm thinking, and you were just kind of mentioning FDA, maybe just to throw it out there. Well, let's start with you, Gabe, but throw it out there for the group. is dealing with the FDA and the regulatory challenges that involves, maybe having a quality management system internally, needing to go make these applications to the actual regulatory authority. Do you see that as a moat that kind of keeps out the riffraff, so to speak, or the other companies, or is it just a challenge you have to overcome? What is it like dealing with regulatory in this industry? I imagine maybe in Gordon, maybe for Pear, they had to. I don't know if you were there at the time, but they had to be convinced that this was even a real thing to some degree. I imagine in the early days. So maybe just how do you see that regulatory?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think it's good to be regulated because ultimately the FDA is giving their stamp of approval. It's kind of the gold standard that this is clinically efficacious and safe. So I think that's really, really important. And it ensures that we hold ourselves to really high standards, really rigorous hazard analyses, that we're building what we intended to build, or the summit of human factors that you mentioned as well. I think the reimbursement, it's all still playing out, I think, how this is all going to be viewed. I think, the premium for prescription over non-prescription. But certainly I think having the FDA's regulation is really ensures it's the highest quality and speaking to providers and they have that confidence as well,
right,
that it's going to be effective.
Yeah, it shows you've gone through a process and demonstrated something. And does anybody else want to comment on regulatory? Is it a blessing or curse or both?
Oh, I guess I'll add a couple of my thoughts. I mean, I guess first would just applaud Pear for being the first one through and really helping the FDA understand how to think about this. And I think in our interactions with the FDA, they keep coming back to this risk-benefit framework. And I think are really trying to figure out how to get these innovative technologies, out to people, particularly fairly low risk interventions that have a potential to have tremendous benefit. And so, I see FDA, clearance there. Also, just being able to help you actually be able to communicate your product. Like, what claims can you say about your product? You're actually treating something. You're improving the care of a disease, and being able to do that on par with any other drug or treatment, I think, is tremendously helpful. And I think if you look at on the App Store, how many thousands of apps are out there for healthcare products?
Hundreds of thousands of health and wellness apps.
But if you look at how many a physician would actually recommend for their patients, it's very few, right? And so if you actually want physicians to integrate these into care, have this be standard of care, you need to do it with evidence, and you need to do it through the same framework as any other medical product.
Yeah, that's exactly true. Proven to be effective, as you said, and then this stamp of approval that, separate from those hundreds of thousands out there that look like they might be okay, here's something that's gone through the FDA process and got cleared by the FDA, and that says this thing works. Yeah, there's studies and so on also, but that FDA piece of it is huge. And the doctor can go, well, they're so rigorous on everything they do at the FDA. If they cleared this software too, I can depend on it. It's going to help people.
Yeah.
So that's key. In relation to your other question, that's been part of Pear's plan ever since the beginning. So our founder and CEO, Corey McCann, had this idea from the beginning. He's a PhD in neuroscience, among other things. And the whole idea was prescription digital therapeutics ever from the start. So the idea of working with the FDA and getting their clearance has always been part of our plan. And yeah, it's a bunch of work, but we have people in our company that know how to work with the FDA. And so that's why we were able to get our software cleared by the FDA. And then doctors will prescribe it with confidence. Patients will use it with the feeling of this is going to work. And then we're helping more and more people with their lives.
Yeah. Very good.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think that was very well spoken. But I will say, addressing your other point, it does create a bit of a barrier to entry, which I think serves us well, and does set us apart from, the myriad other less rigorously tested options.
Yeah, I'm sure. I've been in some discussions with the FDA and some applications. there's a degree of diligence there that goes above and beyond. Well, let's look a little bit to the future before we open up to the audience here. Kristen, at the end of the day, the chronic diseases that you're treating, there really are physical biomarkers here that you can objectively monitor, right? And so at some point say in 5-10 years, does better therapeutics become more? Does it start to pair with diagnostics, with other physical medical devices? Where are we heading in the next decade?
Well, as a newly publicly traded company, I feel like there's a bit of a minefield in the answer of where we're going and what our potential partnerships in the future are. But I think when you frame it with the horizon of 5 to 10 years, I think my answer has to be yes. Like, yes, absolutely. I think we can't even imagine the state of data collecting devices in 5 or 10 years. Gabe and I, before coming up on stage, were talking about the Aura rings that we wear each night to monitor sleep and heart rate variability. So I think that we are fortunate in that the diseases that we're treating do have recognizable and measurable biometrics, and so that can aid in our feedback process, and we can adjust treatment based on day-to-day collection of data. So that feels fortunate. So I hesitate to speculate on what we do in the future, but I know that we will continue to monitor many biometrics, including the ones we are currently monitoring.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, exciting. I think the future is exciting on that for sure. And Gordon, I want to go to you. Looking, maybe looking to the now and to the future. And when I look back in the past, I feel like there was excitement about technology, tech companies, and ultimately the engineers who worked for them were going to democratize access to everything and really change the world for the better. But we've seen lately some of the big tech companies are in the news for less virtuous reasons than we would maybe hope. I guess maybe just talk about a little more about your mission and our prescription digital therapeutics, a place for those mission-driven tech folks to land to really make that difference.
Yeah, that's a great observation you have. A lot of engineers are altruistic and want to help the world. And in some of the companies, especially with social media, the way it's used, that's kind of gone the wrong direction a little bit. And whether it's people doing the right things or wrong things, there's just some negative media and such on that. What we're doing here seems to be a really nice statement of using technology to help people. And it's not so much of a political thing or so on. It's people who are dealing with substance abuse or opioid addiction and having better outcomes and getting their life back on track by having software as a way to help them in their rehab, avoid relapses, get their life back together. So yeah, it's a great message for what engineers, technology, and tech companies and startups can do to help people. Yeah. Definitely so.
Yeah.
We know that technology can change behaviors. We've seen that, and we see that with negative consequences.
We shouldn't doubt it,
so
right?
it's remarkable to use that technology and harness it to change behaviors in these positive ways.
Right. Amen. Let's see, Mike, you're our CEO on the panel, so you can answer the Kristen's question or that I gave to her without, it's up to you on how much you want to divulge. But what does it look like in the future? Are we going to all be wearing heads up XR gear to fully experience our digital therapeutic or what?
I'm not sure about that, but I see digital care delivery being at the core of how we all get our health care. This transactional thing that we do with doctors, a visit every 3 to 6 months, makes zero sense, right? 15 minutes every 3 to 6 months to manage a very chronic, debilitating disease that consumes most of your daily life, it doesn't make sense. So how can we use technology and digital to be how we deliver care, whether that's through digital therapeutics, whether that's through telemedicine, and really have that be the core and the connector for how we can all live our best lives.
Yeah, very cool. Sounds good. Gabe, a little bit, a question in maybe the near future, maybe it's currently present. Once you commercialize one of these PDTs, how does your role, you're now director of product, right? But as a product manager, product lead, how does that change for a PDT company?
Yeah, so I guess we're in a special case now because we're in market under the COVID public health emergency guidance. So we're not FDA cleared yet, but we're still able to go to market. So I guess there are two ways that I guess our product efforts have shifted. The first is pretty obvious. Our focus is now on commercialization rather than just generating clinical outcomes data. And the second is on real world data rather than the clinical trial data. So I can unpack each of those a little bit. On the commercialization side, like I mentioned, our vision is a world where all adolescents have access to affordable, effective mental health care. So just creating effective mental health care, and it's obviously affordable, is not enough. They need to have access, and that comes through providers. Prescribing it, as we've already discussed, is so critical. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on thinking about the provider experience. How do we make it as easy as possible for them to offer it? How do we integrate it into their workflows? Creating a provider portal that gives data like around engagement and clinical efficacy back. I know Pear has a great one and talks a lot about that as well. So in short, we've really been shifting from just focusing on the therapeutic itself to thinking about a whole of product experience. The second, which is about real world data, we know there's a lot of studies that have been published about this, that behavior under clinical trials is often different from behavior in the real world. So it's really exciting now that we actually have that real world data coming in. We've talked about looking at that week on week or day on day data. We can now dive into it quantitatively. We can do UX research, speaking to people that have actually gone through the program, interviewing them, because that's critical to understand the why behind that behavior. So that's already underway. We just launched in October, so we're just getting that first wave of data coming in, and it's already shaping our roadmap. And we're also in a unique position now because we haven't been cleared yet, so it's actually easier for us to make the changes prior to clearance. But even so, post clearance, you still want to be looking at that real world data, running follow-up clinical trials, and iterating and doing progressive releases to make it better and better over time.
So I want to invite the audience, if they have a question or two, please raise your hand. Lori will bring the microphone around. I want to make sure we give you a chance to ask any questions while you have the panel here. Lori might have a question.
I actually have a question, if that's allowed. What about the treatment of ADD for adolescents? Is that something you think you see coming with prescription type therapeutics?
I think it's happening. I think Achille has a cleared product, but it's a great use case. And I think they have a gaming device that is used in the treatment of adolescent ADHD.
Oh, well, that's awesome. I know there's a lot of parents out there who'd be thrilled not to have their kids on medication, right?
Right. Anyone else from
Other questions, comments? The sugar rush did you in, I think.
While you're thinking of, there's one over there.
Hey. So I'm just curious, and I apologize if you covered this because we just sat down a couple minutes ago, but I'm looking at, for instance, Pear. In the App Store, I can just download Somryst, right? So if it's a prescription, can I just download this and use it and theoretically pay for it myself, or I need a prescription, or how does that work?
You need a prescription. So if it's prescribed by a doctor, there's an access code, and without the access code, you can't download it. So
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. It's pretty interesting. Once you become prescription, you start getting regulated by the it's like pharmacy sort of boards, and the way it needs to get distributed, it actually has to get distributed through a pharmacy. So, even the distribution from that perspective is different. So generally the pharmacy will send an access code. So, if you wanted to sign up for Achille, for example, I think they use a company called Phil to distribute their access codes.
An observation is cognitive behavior therapy is typically not delivered by a physician anyway, right? It's a mental health therapist or maybe a psychiatrist. Is that a missed opportunity or something you guys are looking at, like maybe allowing mental health therapists who can't otherwise prescribe pharmaceuticals to prescribe these?
I think it's a. Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
I was going to say that points out the huge vision into the future of what's possible. There's so many more things that can be done. How about somebody who wants to use a product, but their doctor or any clinic near them doesn't have someone prescribing it? Can they find someone somewhere and get under their care if it's covered by insurance, or maybe they want to pay for it themselves? And then you get into the stuff you were talking about, so go ahead with that. But I just think that the world of possibilities is enormous beyond where we are today, which is, it's pretty neat where we are today. The world of possibilities is incredibly large.
I was just going to say there's a huge shortage of therapists. So the way I look at it is if someone can get access to a therapist that can then prescribe a medication, well, or prescribe a digital therapeutic, they probably don't need the digital therapeutic as much if they are lucky enough to get access to the therapist. But there are so many people out there that just cannot get access to a therapist. They have to pay out of pocket, $150 to $200 an hour, or they're on wait lists. There's just a massive access issue. So it's not a question of, replacement or anything like that, which some people start to sort of try to compartmentalize or think of it in those terms. But I really don't see it that way. It's for all those people who just can't get access to therapists. And that's why, we're going through pediatricians, because access to primary care is much, much more prevalent than being able to get access to a mental health
I was thinking
professional.
less of replacement and more. My wife's a physical therapist, or a mental health counselor, and she sometimes recommends my son, hey, you try this app and it might help you. So I think mental health counselors would want to use and leverage your tools.
It's certainly, we're certainly open to that, and it's certainly available to be offered by any licensed healthcare professional currently. So, but it's not as big of a demand from that. When you talk about driving provider demand, are you solving a top problem for a particular type of provider? The top problem right now is much more along primary care providers and pediatricians than it is along therapists wanting to...
They're front line on these issues.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. Oh, we had one here.
So how do you kind of address the privacy concerns, for the biomarkers data that you collect from these patients all the time? And do you really share this data with any really drug companies, So just general thoughts on that.
Does anybody want to comment on? I think we mentioned before the security level. Gordon mentioned security is kind of a priority and privacy, right?
Security and privacy. So we are all HIPAA compliant, which I think is sort of a baseline. I think Gordon can probably speak to this more specifically, but we also at Better are pursuing high trust certification, which is an additional level of security, not necessarily pertaining to privacy, but all within the same sort of governance of people's really, really private data. I think the question you're asking, though, is a little more along the morality lines and not along the technicality lines. And I don't know, that's a tough question because, we currently have no plans to share data with any pharmacy partners or pharma partners. But there is a way in which aggregated, depersonalized, population-level data will be able to help the treatment of all of these diseases. So I think that's where your question gets interesting, is how can we but we're not sharing individual humans' data, perhaps with their physician under strict, privacy and security. But that population level data, that becomes interesting. I think we personally at Better don't know exactly how that becomes useful, but I can see that there are interesting things to think about there.
Do we have time for one more?
Of course.
I was wondering if any of your companies see a application that's economically viable in underserved portions of the world, because obviously most people in, say, like Africa or other portions of the world that are more rural don't have as much access to a healthcare provider in a physical building. And so any of you talk about that and what you can do in these underserved populations?
One of our missions is access. And it's not just for people who have a doctor and insurance coverage and so on. So we have a public coverage, and people looking at that, you can check the recent decision in the state of Massachusetts for coverage that they provide. And we think this is a trend where you're going to find more public coverage, and that's just in the United States alone. But if you look into West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and so on, where we've been getting grants for treatment of people, they're kind of an underserved population that doesn't have access to a lot of the usual things that we may think of. And so that's been something we spent a lot of attention and effort on, and we're really trying to make our products available to those kind of people. So availability and access is huge. You can go beyond the United States with that, as you said. Great point, too. We have ideas of what could be done international. There's a lot of ground to cover right in the United States right now.
I'll just add on. I love that question, and I think that's really the true potential of what we're all developing is access, and the cost of distribution is so low, right? That you can see that world where someone in Africa who has no chance of having any sort of like specialized behavioral therapy could have access to the highest line, evidence-driven, consistent approach for better care management.
Yeah, just add to that it's important to take into account sort of not just language translations, but cultural adaptations as well. Even mental health and therapy that is more effective. There are a lot of well-known cross-cultural differences, so you really want to be thoughtful about how you adapt it. But certainly, for us at Limbics, as I mentioned, our vision is a world where all adolescents have access to affordable, effective mental health care, not just English-speaking adolescents with depression in the US. That's where we're starting, but we'll be expanding that out, to Spanish speakers, which in the US, which there's a huge demand for, and then expanding out diagnoses, and then across throughout the world. There's a lot of interest from Japan and Korea. We just raised a round, and one of our lead investors is from Korea, or is a Korean investor. So we definitely have plans to do that.
Well, are we? I don't know. I think we're at about the time. If there's one last question, we could squeeze it in.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Hello. It's a very exciting topic. I need to somehow. How about hardware in combination with the software? So, for instance, where we were talking about, because we have a hardware which is sending the data, and then the data are analyzed, and then blah, blah, blah. For instance, in Japan, there is this hugging robot, okay? It hugs you, and then it's a therapeutics, right? Because it's giving you good feeling, and it's evident that the people are feeling better and so on. So is this a potential prescription digital therapeutics in terms of combination of hardware and software? What do you think about this?
Yes, I think there's clearly multiple different modalities that you can use. Software and hardware combinations are very viable as a digital therapy.
Yeah, when you think about access, for example, I think that's just one thing to take into account, which is that most people have a smartphone, but they might not necessarily have a VR headset or some other type of hardware. I think it's very, very exciting, but we actually at Limbic started off in virtual reality, but we realized that if access is a major goal, then requiring people to spend hundreds of dollars extra to get a piece of hardware, which most people by default do not have, just didn't justify it. So I think you really needed to balance that. Ideally, using the hardware that people already have, and then obviously as adoption goes up of various new types of hardware, then you can leverage that as well.
And there
But
are
I
companies
definitely
that
want one of
have-
those things that hugs you.
Cool.
Totally. We
It
all
sounds
need
really
that.
good.
If I can have one more thing, what do you think about the timeline and like how far in the future, according you, will be these technologies like widely accepted and especially in terms of insurance companies and so on, which are very, very difficult to deal with and so on. Like, what do you think? Is it like in 5 years, 10 years, or how far are we looking at?
I think we all hope it's sooner than 5 or 10 years. Pear's really leading the way.
We're really in the middle of that right now, and we have insurance coverage for our products, and we keep talking to big insurance companies about getting coverage in more and more places and have more covered lives. So the time frame is immediate, but yeah, it's going to grow a lot. When does it become pervasive or more commonly accepted in the country? I think we'll just see it trending upward continually. It's just going to be, more people are going to be aware of this, and more insurance companies are going to cover these things because they can see it helps people who are part of, who are on their insurance plan. In terms of time frame, I mean, this is what we're doing right now. When does it become more pervasive? I don't know, 3 to 5 years, it'll be much more commonly understood by people, maybe. Y'all can chime in with your thoughts.
All right, I just say that, I mean, like, here we're 4 different companies doing this. There's a whole lot more, right? And so I think this is one that, the tide lifts all boats. And as we all make efforts and get payers comfortable with how to think about this, like what benefit category to fall into, it's going to become more widely adopted. And we're at that stage where I think everyone's figuring it out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I ask you to maybe give a round of applause to a great panel. I
Yes,
appreciate
thank
everybody's
you.
contributions.
Thank you for
And-
staying till the end of the day.